All right. Hello. Welcome to yesterlore. Oh Lord, what number are we even on? It'll be in the title of the YouTube upload of this, so YouTube will know. I think 14, maybe we're at 15. Now it's gonna kill me if I don't look it up. We are at number... Could it be 15? Yeah. 16. 16. Wow, further than I thought. Yeah, we're at yesterlore number 16. So, I'm actually somewhat on time today, as opposed to generally. I'm usually a few minutes late, maybe more than a few minutes late, for the 7 p.m. Pacific time. However, it is not so today. So I am going to just make sure that I have the right chat doc open, because sometimes what happens is it says that the chat is updating, but nothing happens, and then I find out later that people were talking in the chat, and I just didn't see. So I'm going to ensure that that's set up correctly. All right. I have to check mobile, actually, just to make sure that's set up right. Let's see. All right, we should be set up correctly. So, today, I kind of went in to today expecting to maybe do 2 or 3 stanzas, because there is a lot to say about some of these, even though these are the remaining runes that do not have equivalents in the Old Norse rune poems. However, there's something in the wind today that makes me feel like it's possible we can actually finish, which seems ambitious compared to the pace that we've been at. But we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more. We have mostly been doing 2 or 3 per session. We started out doing a lot more than that, but I found that it was better to kind of slow it down and talk more deeply about some of these Old English difficulties in this text. It's a very difficult text in some ways. So, all logic should tell us that we're not going to finish today. But I don't know. I just feel like we might be able to. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first of these 5 stanzas to do. Now, reminder, like I just said a minute ago, these are the 5 stanzas at the end of the Old English rune poem that do not have any equivalents outside of Old English, and potentially Old Frisian. Again, I said last time I'm not as familiar with the Old Frisian runes, but I think some of these might show up in Old Frisian. I'm not going to state one way or the other, though. So, in terms of rune poems, these are only in the Old English rune poem. They are not in the Old Norse rune poems, which are going to be what we read. Not next, because like I said last time, I think we're going to do some Gothic maybe next week, or the week following if we don't finish today. But we'll get to the Old Norse rune poems pretty soon. These 5 are not there. In fact, there are a lot that are not there. We talked about that a bit. But particularly these 5 don't even show up in Elder Futhark. These are sort of later inventions of Old English rune users, because of some changes that happened from the earlier Germanic system to the Old English system. So the first of these is Ak. Now, I think with this one we could potentially treat it like a rune riddle, like we've been doing with some of these. If you're super familiar with Old English sound changes to modern English, you might be able to guess what the word means based on how it sounds, Ak. But if not, it's possible to treat this kind of potentially as a riddle, although the answer is actually inside of the poem. You might see it when we get there. It's in the last sort of line of the poem of the stanza. So I'm going to go ahead and, as per usual, I'm going to read it in Old English, and then I'm going to read it in, we're going to go through the words in Modern English and see if anyone in the chat wants to try to guess what it is before I reveal the actual meaning of the rune's name, if we know it. There are quite a few of these, though, that are a little bit mysterious today. But the first one, we know. We're like very, very confident that we know what the meaning of the rune is, the rune's name. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, Ak bithon eurvan elda barnum, flashes fodor fereth yaloma, over ganotis bath, garsej fandath quadra ak habba adala treoa. So, we actually see the name of the rune in, I should probably be putting my cursor there, here. So we see Ak is the name of this rune, and then Ak is also right here. So if we can get to the meaning of that part, we might probably be able to get to the meaning of the rune, because it's the same word. I will spoiler that part. So Ak, whatever that is, Bith on Eorthan. Eorthan is the earth. We've seen that word a few times. Eorthan is an oblique form. I think it's dative here. So whatever this thing is in the earth or on the earth. And then we have a formula which we've seen before. Elda barnum. Here the word is elda. It's the genitive plural. Barn is child. So it's the children of, here, usually it's ilda or ilda. It means like the people. It's related to a word for generation or something like that. So the people, it's yet another generic like word for men in the genitive plural, for humans, and it's the sons or the children of those people. So the children of people. And once again, that's another way, a poetic way of saying everybody. There are a couple of those formulae that we've seen so far. That we've seen. And this is one of them. This is an example. Ilde Bernum. So this thing is on earth to everyone. It's in the dative plural ending here. So it's to everyone or for everyone. It's for everyone on earth. What is it for everyone on earth? It is flashes fodor. Here we go. Fodor here is sort of the word, and then flashes is the genitive, so it's a possessive sort of like, this is where, this S here is where the apostrophe S comes from in English. So it is the flashes, the fleshes, flash is flesh, fodor, and fodor is where we get the word fodder. Its root is fold, which is where we get food from. The verb is fedan, to feed, to give food to. In Proto-Germanic it was like foliana, and that becomes fedan in Old English. But fodor is sort of that which you feed upon. Usually it's the food for animals that's when it's used. However, it could just be just fodder, anything that's used. Here it's the fodder of the flesh. So this thing is on earth the flesh's fodder. Fodder. Sorry, I can't really speak modern English very well today. But yeah, the fodder of the flesh for everyone on earth. Okay, sounds pretty important. Fereth yeloma over ganotis bath. So fereth, it fares, it goes. Yeloma. Yeloma means often. This is a word that actually survived into Middle English as iloma as well. Iloma. And I think it would be a cool word to bring back. If it would be something like alum or something in Middle English, like A-L-O-O-M or I-L-O-O-M, something like that. And it's really nice. Or we might have a silent E at the end there still, just for aesthetic. It just means often, frequently. So it fares frequently, frequently, yeloma, over ganotis bath. And we've seen this word bath before. It means bath. But it's something's bath. And when we've seen that before, usually we can tell we have some kind of kenning, some kind of metaphorical reference. So it's not literally a bath, it's something's bath. Before we saw like fish's bath, which was the fish's bath. So that was a poetic way of saying the ocean. This is similar. Ganotis bath is the gannet's bath. And a gannet is a kind of bird. If you're not familiar with it, I actually got a picture of a gannet here. I'll put the link to this picture because I don't want to be stealing it. But this is a gannet. It's a kind of water, like seaside bird. I've seen them a few times in real life, but that's what's being referred to as a gannet in Old English. So not a huge change from Old English in terms of its name. So the gannetes bath is probably another way of saying like the sea or the sort of the water by the shore, maybe. If we're specifying gannets, maybe it's the water by the shore. So there we go. There's Gannett's bath. That's just what this hyperlink is over here. I like to put them on the word so I don't lose them before the stream when I'm doing my preparation here. So it goes often over the Gannett's bath, and then it says Garsej fandath whether ak haba adala trewa. So Garsej, we might have seen this word before. It's kind of etymologically mysterious. It seems like it's from God, which means spear. It's where we get the word gore from, gory. It comes from the word for spear. And sej, we've seen a bunch of times means warrior, or it gets used as another one of those generic words for man or person. So that's kind of strange. God sej, spearman. Or it could be sedge like the plant that we saw in one of our runes earlier, Eolch sedge. Eolch sedge was way up here. Eolx sedge. Eolch sedge. The X is kind of tricky, but probably this represents the X sound. It's just Eolch sedge is usually not spelled with an X, but any kind of X or X in Old English can sometimes get spelled with an X, so that makes sense to use. But sedge there is a kind of sort of marsh or wetland plant. So spear wetland plants, spear sedge, still doesn't really make sense for ocean, but it is a really common, like fairly common poetic word for ocean in Old English. And we just know from context most of the time that it must mean ocean. So that's how we translate it. Garsej is just one of those weird words for ocean that we have. Old English has lots of those. So Garsej fandath. Fandath is from the verb fandian. Fandian means to test, to try, to prove, to examine. It's related to find, actually. Findan is find. Fandian is more like a cause to find. It's more like you find out, you try to examine something, test it, prove it. So the ocean or the sea proves or tests or examines whether. Whether here is just simply the word weather in modern English. Whether, ak, here's this word ak, and I don't think I will translate it yet because it is the answer to the riddle, so maybe I won't translate it. Whether this thing habe adele trewa. Ooh. You know, this might, never thought of it this way, but this could actually be a double entendre or a pun. I'll explain in just a second. So, adela, we've seen this word before. Adela means, well, it could mean a couple things here, actually. Adel, we've seen the word adeling before. Adeling means like a prince or a noble. We've seen it a few times in some of, again, one of those formulae that just means everybody. Sorry, I know this happens a lot, but the fireplace keeps freezing. It's really just a GIF that I'm sharing, but sorry to spoil the illusion, but it is a GIF, and it freezes sometimes just because it's not open. It's open, but it's not what I'm clicking on primarily. Mostly clicking on this other window, and when that happens, I think it just freezes sometimes, or most of the time. So I'm sorry about that. Not sure how to fix that, but I'll try to figure something out. It happens like every week, and I'm only just now really talking about it. So this word adela, here it's probably an adjective, means noble. And the interesting thing is the E there tells me that it's probably in the dative. No. It's not in the dative. It's probably in the accusative. It's the object of habbe. Habbe there is the verb habban, which is to have. It's where have comes from. And it being so this is a third person. This thing has, but it doesn't end with a thorn, like a thorn or an that we'd usually expect this, because it's in the subjunctive mode, which means it's sort of like a hypothetical situation, which is this is what we're doing. We're trying to test whether this thing has hypothetically. So in Old English, you'd use what's called a subjunctive mode. If anyone here speaks any sort of German, other Germanic language, or a Romance language, you'll probably be familiar with the subjunctive mood. Old English had a subjunctive mood. Even technically modern English does, like in really formal registers. And sometimes even informal registers, people will use were instead of was in sort of counterfactual situations, and that's a preservation of the preterite, subjunctive. There, the past subjunctive. Habba here is the verb, and adala treo is the object, because treo is feminine. Treo here, and this is how I know what it means, even though it's possibly a ton or double entendre. It means like faith or truth, or usually more like loyalty, faith. Truth usually is like treoth, but it could be also be treo, the noun. Treo is where we get the word true, but this noun form, we actually have frozen a genitive of it, an irregular genitive actually, because I think the genitive comes from like a, it's like a masculine or neuter form of the genitive with an S at the end. Treus, which is where I get the word truce from. So it's like a faithfulness, truth, loyalty. It's usually how it gets translated, treo. And it's adala treo. It's a noble truth. Not truth, but like loyalty, holding true. I think it's adala because it's the object here, because it's feminine. It could also, though, be, the reason I'm hesitating, and I think this could be dative still, adala, is it could be like, if it has faithfulness, like nobly, in nobility, or something like that. I think that is one possible way to translate it, but I think I'm just going to stick with it has noble truth. So let me go through the English breakdown of this real quick and see what we can glean. It might not be possible to guess, actually, now that I think about it. So, Ak is, on the earth to everyone, flesh is fodder. It's food for the flesh. It often goes over the gannet's bath, the sort of seabirds' hangout spot. The sea tests or proves whether it has noble faithfulness or noble loyalty, or true loyalty in nobility, or something like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and say what this means, because I don't know if it's actually guessable. Ak is where we get the word oak from, and it does indeed mean oak, like the tree, which actually kind of makes the meaning of this a bit tricky. Now, if you want sort of a good analysis of what this could mean, there is the link that I actually shared in last week's stream, which is on YouTube still, and I think it, in theory, should still be on Twitch as well, although it's not linked there. I do mention it, though. It's Old English rune poems. I don't have the link open right now, but it is in YouTube, and it will be linked here on this one when I put it up to YouTube as well. It is an awesome rune resource on the Old English rune poem by Drekisdottir, and it has a sort of breakdown of what this could mean, because it is kind of strange if you actually think about the literal meaning of this, knowing that ak means oak. So it's like the oak is the flesh is fodder to everyone on earth. It often goes over the gannet's bath. The sea tests whether the oak has noble truth, noble faithfulness. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense on its face, so there is definitely some interpretation that needs to go into understanding what this poem could mean. So I definitely recommend that website to kind of go into that a bit more deeply. And I would also just look at a lot of other translations besides the one I just gave, to see what you think the poem actually means at the face of it. What does it mean for the oak to be the flesh's fodder for everyone on earth? or to go often over the gannet's bath. Do oaks frequently go over the water? I actually don't know. I don't think I've seen many oaks on the seashore, but I could be wrong about that. But that is Ak. That is that rune poem. So we're going to go on to the next one. And we kind of have a bit of a theme here, hint as to what this could mean. So this one is called Ash, and the discerning amongst those viewing might be able to guess what this means already. Although it might not be what you initially think, just hearing what it sounds like. Because this actually has a bit of a sort of a semantic shift a little bit in English from the Old English. The word is still used in the same way that it is used in Old English, but it has some other use as well. And so that is something to be aware of. So I'm going to go ahead and read this as per usual sorry, I'm just getting some weird notifications. I need to silence. Sorry, give me a moment. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read this, and we're going to get into it in Old English, and then we'll break the words down. So, Ash with overha, eldum dyra, stíthon stadola, stede richte hilt, thach him theuchtan on fires monige. So, Ash with overha. This thing, Ash, is overha, and one emendation that's typically made is that this is made into, pardon me, it's made into a one-word compound. It doesn't really matter that much from an Old English manuscript perspective. They usually just put spaces between compounds. So, but in terms of just modern English normalization, or modern normalization of Old English, we typically just put them into one word. So, overha is going to mean like overly high. Ha is where we get the word high from. Ha. And then over can mean overly or exceedingly. It's very, very high. This thing is very high. Eldum dyra. And this is this word that's more standardly eld in West Saxon. This is sort of a weird holdover from a different dialect usually. But elda is sort of people. So dear to people. Dyra here is another form of, like we saw deora before. This is just another form of it with some I umlaut. But dyra, dear to people. Nothing too strange there. Precious to people. Stith on stadola. Stith is a old word for firm or stiff. It's not where stiff comes from, if I'm remembering correctly, but it means firm. It's just another word for firm in Old English. There's plenty of those. We've seen some of them. And then stadol is a sort of the foundation of something, or the stem. If it's a tree, it's a trunk. Just the thing that something is built upon here. This thing is overly high. It's firm in its foundation. You'd hope if it's high, it's going to have a firm foundation. So it's stiff in foundation. Stede richte hilt. Now, I've seen this part translated a few different ways, and a lot of it hinges around the interpretation of this word here, hilt. Now, we've talked a bit about how I and Y in these later Old English West Saxon dialect manuscripts can sometimes get confused, and so some people read this as the word hilt or hilta, which means hilt. Is where the word hilt comes from, like of a sword, which could make sense if we're talking about like a stem or a trunk or something. But I think it's actually a verb here. I think it's the verb haldan in the third person singular. In West Saxon, sometimes what you see is, or most of the time if you're in standard West Saxon, there is what is called umlaut, where the a in haldan is, and I'll spell actually haldan here. Haldan in the third person singular, to say like, so haldan means hold, by the way. I haven't actually said that yet. Haldan means to hold. It's where we get the word hold from. In the third person singular, so if someone holds or something holds, it would, in other dialects, usually be something like haldeth, with this thorn ending that we're used to for the third person singular. But in West Saxon, something happens where we get umlaut, which we'd actually expect given where the ending comes from. That what we see in other dialects is actually a little bit more of like a analogy or sort of regularizing of the paradigm from what it probably would be if you just applied sound changes. The West Saxon is a little bit more of like retaining what the older situation would have been, which is that there were front vowels here that would then cause umlaut. And so we get something more like this, which when we have this kind of situation where we have a D or a T followed by a thorn, it kind of simplifies to something like this. So hilt would be someone holds. Hilt is hold. And we know, I've said this before, that in later West Saxon, I becomes a lot of the time. So, hilt. So I think this is the verb haldan, and I think that makes sense because it holds stedda. Stedda is place. It holds its place, rikta, rightly. It rightly holds its place, or holds a place rightly, which I think makes a lot of sense for it's firm in its foundation, rightly holds its place. Thar him feiltan on firas monia. So, thar, we've seen this word before, it means though. So, though, him, so this is a dative, so to him, to this thing, feiltan on firas monia. Now, this is actually a little tricky in terms of the word order here. This is a product of some weird behavior with the verb feiltan in Old English. In modern English, we can... So, feiltan is where we get the word fight from. To fight. It's the verb, to fight. In modern English, we can say, I fight someone. Right? We can have a direct object of fight. I fight... You can fight something. Right? Directly. We can also fight with or against someone, and the meaning doesn't change a whole lot. In Old English, you usually... There's maybe a couple exceptions to this. I can think of one. But usually, feiltan can't have a direct object. You actually need to say fight against, which would usually be with the preposition with, or upon. So it's on. I'm going to say who we're fighting. Yeah, someone in the chat said, wait, who are we fighting? It's actually firas monia, who are the subject here. Many people. Firas monia. And I believe, I'm not mistaken, that this has to be nominative. This could be accusative, I think, potentially. But in either case, this is a plural. Firas is people. Monia is many in the plural form of the adjective. So many people. Though many people, him feiltan on. So like in the Dynasty Warriors game. I've never played Dynasty Warriors, actually. So there's some weird word order stuff going on here, and I think part of it is just to keep this in the right spot to have the stress to alliterate with firas here, because the alliteration's on the end. So it's if I were to reorder this in sort of like a standard sentence order in Old English, I'd probably say something like feilten firas monia on him. That's great for stress sleep. Yeah. I will have to look into Dynasty Warriors. So it would be more like, though many warriors fight on him. Fight upon him. Because in Old English we say fight, and then we need a preposition, which will then, here this preposition on requires a dative. But it's just kind of strange that the on is actually coming after the verb. That does happen sometimes when it's like the second stress of the syllable. I think the on is actually stressed here metrically. Thar him feiltan on firas monia. Because I don't think it's on firas monia. I don't think that makes much sense here. Though, to him, fight on many... So, who's fighting? That would be the question. Who is fighting there? If it's not the many people. But I think it makes sense for this to be plural here. the plural subject here. Though, so let me go over the whole thing. Ash, whatever ash means, is overly tall. It's over high. It's precious to people. It's firm in its foundation. It holds its place truthfully, rightly, though many people fight him or fight upon him, him being the ash. Now, ash, if you weren't able to guess, actually I want to see if people want to guess what ash means here. I think this is guessable. It's something that is firm, it's overly tall, it holds its place, holds its spot, even when people are fighting. Ash. And it is related to the modern English word ash, but maybe not the word ash we think it is. It is a tree. It is particularly an ash tree. So here's a picture of an ash tree. I liked this one because it's looking up, because our first sort of half line is ash bith over half. It's overly high. Ash trees, I think, can get pretty tall. There's a lot of different varieties of ash tree. I don't know if this is one that you'd see in England. I've said this before, I'm not a botanist. I've begged the chat for any kind of botanical knowledge that they might have. But ash was very commonly used to build spears, to make spears. And so a lot of the time in Old English poetry, we'll see that ash is used as a sort of poetic shorthand or sort of synonym for spera or god, but which both mean spear. So people use ash instead of those other words for spear to mean spear, essentially. So I think that's why the fighting is coming up. Though many fight the spear, it holds its spot. It's a strong wood, which is why it would be chosen to make spears out of. It's firm in its foundation. It's a very nice wood to make a spear with. And so that is what this rune refers to. Like I said, the link is just to the image that I have there. So this is not the first rune poem that we've had that kind of has this sort of theme of like a type of wood that is strong and sort of extolled for its strength. We had that with Eoch up here. Eoch bith utan unsmede treo. It was a hard and fast in the earth. The guardian of fire we saw of Eoch, which is the yew tree, Y-E-W. And we just had another tree recently. It's oak. Yeah, oak was literally the last one we had. Although oak isn't really emphasized for its firmness here. It's talked about as being the fodder for flesh and going over the gannet's bath. So, although it is said to be trustworthy, true, faithful, faith or loyalty is this word here, treo. The reason I said that this was a pun, potentially, I actually didn't go over that, is that treo also, when it's neuter in gender, I believe, at least it comes from a neuter word. I think it might still be neuter in Old English. It should be. It's neuter in Proto-Germanic. Anyways, either way, treo, when it's not feminine here, like it is here, when treo is feminine, it means truth or faithfulness. But treo, neuter, means tree. It's where we get the word tree. So oak is the rune, and it's up to the ocean to judge whether oak has noble loyalty, but also this word treo means tree. So I was saying it could also be sort of like a pun that an Old English speaker would know that treo means tree, although like this is telling you that's the feminine word and therefore not meaning tree. It is interesting. That's why I was pointing that out. But yeah, we've had quite a few trees, which I think makes sense. So yeah, ash is another tree, although oftentimes it's shorthand for the spears that you make out of the wood from the tree. All right, let's go to the next one. And the next one is actually one that is a little tricky in terms of the name here. Now, we're pretty sure we know what it's referring to, given the stanza, and what we know actually of the Old Norse rune poem now, the rune poems, sorry, plural. Now, the interesting thing is, I did say earlier that all of these 5 runes that we're looking at, they don't have equivalents in the younger Futhark. These runes don't exist. They only really exist in the Old English rune poem. And And some of these actually don't even appear outside of manuscripts. Like, we don't see any examples of, for example, this rune here used anywhere in any like sort of runic inscriptions that I'm aware of. I think I've seen that said before, that this only really appears in manuscripts that might have been made later. Quite a few of these might be later. I have seen this rune and this rune in at least one, and I've definitely seen Ak and Ash before, but some of these are a little bit like potentially made up later to fill in sort of gaps in the older runes to account for changes that happen in Old English. Yeah, so anyway, we'll get to that sort of difficulty with this name in a bit, and how can it be that the Old Norse rune poem gives us information about this rune when they don't have an equivalent to this rune. I will explain when we get there. So, but let's start with the mystery, and say that Ir bith Adelinga an Eorla Yahwas, win on Wurthmund, bith on Widge fire fast leech on Farelda, Fird Yatawa sum. Now, I hesitated there and double took this part because this needs to be amended, I believe. Let's look at Hicks's version here. Yeah, so this, see everyone and their mother. I've never not seen someone make this emendation, that this should be a T here. And you can see, if we look at T and C in the Insular Old English script, they look very similar. It's really easy to have one be smudged and mistaken for the other, and that's probably what happened to Mr. George Hicks over here. Or maybe the scribe just forgot to line cross their T. It's also possible. But Yatoa is actually a word, Yakawa is not. It's just not a word, so we just know this has to be Yatoa. Now, that's not always as simple, and this sort of style of writing T persisted into sort of Middle English, and this is where we get the famous issue of the name of the green, the sort of lord in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's written like this in the Middle English manuscript, where it's like this letter, but it's a bit smudged, so it could be this, and it could be this, and so you'll see sometimes the lord is called Berdalac, and sometimes he's called Bertalac or Bersalac or something like that, and it's because that whole CT confusion. That's a common issue, so it's not that far of a stretch to just kind of fix this and say, this is a word, and it makes sense in context. This is not a word, it makes no sense in context. At least it's not a word that makes sense here. Yakiwa doesn't, I don't think there's any Yakwa word I'm aware of. I know there's Yak, but there's no Yakwa. So this thing is Adelinga an Erla Yahwas, win on Worthmund. That's sort of the first clause there. So this genitive plural generic words for lord or noble, we've seen sort of this kind of formula before with Yahwas here, meaning sort of any or each. It's another one of those each among people, insert generic word for person or lord or man or noble here. So this thing is among nobles and princes, each, win on the Worthmund. Win on the Worthmund. Win, we've seen before. We had a whole rune that was called win. It means joy. Happiness, joy. And Worthmund, worth by itself it's usually worth, actually, more standardly worth. Can we sell like deora dura here in this later West Saxon dialect? Things coalescing a bit. Worth is worth, and then mind is actually memory. But worthmund as a compound usually means something like glory, that which is worthy of being remembered. So this thing, Ir, is a joy and glory, sort of noble thing among nobles and princes. Among every noble and prince. Everyone loves this thing. It's great. It bith on widja fire. We've had widge before. Widge means steed. It's something that you ride, usually a horse. It's usually just another poetic way of saying horse without saying horse. And we know there's a couple words for horse. Horse was actually one of our runes. It is on a steed. It is what? Bith Fayed is the word fair. We've had that before too. So it's fair on a steed. It looks nice. If you're on a horse and you have this thing, it looks nice. Fast leech on farelde. Fareld is a journey, a faring. We've seen the word ferian and feran and faran before. They all have to do with traveling or going somewhere. So fareld is a journey, and it is fast leech on one of those. Fast leech, we've seen sort of fast before a few times. It's firm, trustworthy. Here's probably more like handy. It's handy on a journey. Looks nice if you're riding a horse. Everybody loves it. And what is it? It is Fyrdjatawasum. Fyrdjatawasum. Fyrd, and another emendation that's often made is just that it's another one of these, where it's probably a compound here. Fyrdjatwa. Now, Fyrd means like a military host, like a regiment or a... I don't actually remember what you would actually call what. I'm not an expert on Old English military organization. That's not what I'm here to do. But it basically just means a military group, a host. I like using the word host. It's very, very neutral as far as I'm aware. Anyone who has military experience can probably correct me if it has a more specific modern meaning, but it means host. This military group. It puts you in a military context, at least. And yatwa basically means equipment. And this is a genitive plural of yatwa. So it's among military equipment, sum. And sum is a really interesting word. I think we've had it in at least one poem. Maybe not the rune poem, but maybe another poem. Actually, I'm pretty certain we've had sum. Actually, I'm going to search. When did we have sum? We had sum here, takna sum. And we saw back here that this was an example of this. Sum means one, like the number one. Now, the word one when you're counting is on, but sum is sort of like when you're actually using one as a noun, like one of something. Usually the of something is going to be a genitive plural, and then you have sum, one among this group. An exemplar is what sum is usually going to mean. Now, the plural of sum is usually summa. Summa with an E if it's masculine. Summa or summe with an E or an A if it's feminine, and if it's neuter, it's usually, I think it stays sum. But in any case, that plural is actually where we get the word sum from. Sum, S-O-M-E in modern English, is actually the plural of sum, which is the singular for one. So sum is actually the plural of one, and that's exactly what happens in Spanish. The word for sum is just the word one in the plural. That happens in quite a few Indo-European languages that they'll do that, because it's a lot of Indo-European languages use the number one as an indefinite pronoun. Old English didn't really have indefinite pronouns. It's the closest thing you get is sum. So what does that mean? This means it is one of military equipment, like an example of military equipment. So how does that help us know what this means? Well, it doesn't entirely tell us what this means. So this thing is a joy and worthy thing amongst nobles and princes. It is nice looking on a steed, and it is handy on a trip, and it is an example of military equipment. So what could it be? That could be a lot of things, actually. The fair on a horse is kind of interesting, given what we think this means. I don't think this helps us a whole lot. It's not like a saddle or something like that. And here's where we get into the Old Norse rune poem. We'll talk about this more when we get into the Norwegian and Icelandic rune poems, sort of the weirdness with this name. But there is a rune called Yr, Y-R, in the Younger Futhark that is used in Old Norse. And it is used, however, for the name of this rune, which actually flips upside down in the Younger Futhark. It's written just completely vertically flipped. However, its name is cognate with Eoch here. Eoch meaning the yew tree. But in Old Norse, one thing that's made out of yew a lot of the time is bows. And so one interpretation of this rune's name is that it's a bow, because that's what it means in Old Norse, a bow, like that you use to shoot arrows. And a bow would make sense here, except for the horse bit. I mean, archers on horseback I guess they look aesthetic. I don't think it necessarily precludes anything else, though. So a bow is a joy and worthy thing to everyone who is a noble or a prince or just anyone who fights. It's nice. It looks cool. You're shooting it from a horse. It's handy on a trip, and it is indeed an example of military equipment. So that's kind of the way that most people end up going with Eid here. That, but why? If this is the Old Norse cognate to this rune, how is it in Old English? Well, some people think, especially because this rune is specific to Old English, it's not in the Elder Futhark, that both the Younger Futhark of Old Norse and Old English eventually come from, that this was created later. Like most of these seem to have been made at a later stage after Old English had gone through all of its changes that make it uniquely Old English. And if these are later runes, it's possible that these were made and named, or at least that this rune poem was written at a time when the English had, I mean, certainly by the time that this manuscript was written, even if this poem was composed earlier, by the time this manuscript was written, given the late West Saxon dialect that it's written in, the English had definitely come into contact with lots of Old Norse speakers. There were, the Danelaw had already been a thing for a long time at this point that this manuscript was probably written. So it's possible they just loaned the name from Old Norse. Because if you squint, you can see how this rune might look like that flipped upside down version of Eorch that we saw. If you flip this upside down, you have like sort of the three tines that would be facing down instead of up. And this kind of looks like that. It has three tines. It's not always connected. Sometimes there's like a cross bar in the middle that joins these three at the bottom. So I wish I could zoom in a bit better. But basically, imagine a horizontal line going across, cutting through the middle of this. Not going through the edges, but kind of contained inside the outer lines, just so that these three bottom sort of tines would be connected with vertical, like a horizontal bar in the middle. So you can kind of imagine how maybe they would say they look similar, and we're just going to borrow the name from the Old Norse runes that they might have seen. It's possible. We just don't know. So the idea here is that this is bow, and it comes from the Old Norse rune poem. What do you know? We have about 10 minutes left-ish, and we're almost done. I didn't think we'd actually finish the poem today, but we could. If we go quickly through this rune poem, although that seems a little bit difficult, we could finish today. I don't want to leave one left for next week, so let's see if we can get through it. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next one. Hopefully there's no questions or anything about this rune poem. If there are, though, please feel free. I would love to ask questions. And I think I can stay a little bit later today, too. So if there are any questions, just let me know, and I'm happy to answer or engage with any of them. So we're going to go to the penultimate rune poem in the Old English rune poem. I'm very excited here. Now, this reading here, I'm going to explain why I have these two things here. And that's because in Hicks's version, he has two things written here. He has Io, I-O, and Iar here. So some people name this rune Iar, and some people name it Ior. It's a difficult word either way, because we don't really see it anywhere else, either of these. So we're not quite sure what to make of this one. There's some debate about what this means as well. And we'll talk about that if I can do that quickly enough. So, emendations. I'm going to try to get through those first before I start reading, so we don't have to waste too much time on it. So, one is that this is usually bound together as one word, and I'll explain it when we get there. This is usually separated into two words. And I think that is it. Yeah, I think that's it for emendation. So let's get started. So I'm going to read it as Iar just because this is the one that's all one word. He just puts the I-O above because maybe this could be Ior as well. Just depends on the dialect. And that would make sense to me. So, Iar bith a fixa, an thech a bruketh, fodris an faldan. Sorry, I missed an emendation. I was going to say that doesn't sound right. I think this is foldan, on foldan, because on faldan doesn't make sense. Sorry, I knew I was probably missing one. Alright, fodres on foldan, hadet feierne erd watre beworpen, thar he winnum leovath. So, Iar, whatever that is affixa. Now, there's a lot of arguments as to why it should be separated or combined. I think it should be combined. Some people even get rid of this A here. Some people even do this. affix a, and I'll explain what basically all three of those would mean. So, a means river, a, and then fix is another way of writing fish. We've seen SC, that sound, fish. Usually it's a sh sound, but in some dialects it's sk, and that can metaphysize, switch order sometimes, and be fixed. We see that with the word to ask as well in Old English. Askian can sometimes become axion, and that shows up a lot with an X sometimes as well. Some people in modern English think that is incorrect to say it with an X, but it goes back to Old English actually having an X in that word, because ska and sh and x get switched around a lot in Old English, and it's just a common metathesis to make. So, a is river, and fixa here is the genitive plural of fish. So it would be like, this thing is of river fishes. Whatever this thing is. Maybe it's one of river fishes. Some people even add the word som here after, although that doesn't really work poetically, metrically here. But I think it could just be, this thing is of the river fishes. Some people argue that this shouldn't be plural, and it is. They say that this thing is a river fish. And some say this thing is a river of fishes. Or of fishes, the river. So those are the arguments for separate. I think of the river fishes, or one of the river fishes, makes sense, potentially. So I'm just going to leave it the way that it seems to be in the manuscript, although I'm combining them. Because compounds tend to be spaced out, as we've seen. So, this thing is of the river fishes. Anthech a bruketh. And though abruketh doesn't really make much sense. We've had brukan before. It means to enjoy or use. A prefixed on. I'm not sure if I've ever even seen that. Abrukan. Not sure how to make sense of it. But abruketh makes sense. A means ever, or like always. It always enjoys. It ever enjoys. And we saw that brukan, last week, we saw that brukan takes a genitive object. So you enjoy of something, or you make use of something. And so the thing that you enjoy is foldres. And this is that same word foldor that we had a couple poems ago. Foldor is fodder. So it enjoys fodder. And then this said onfaldan. That doesn't really make much sense to me. I think it's onfoldan. This second sort of part of the first half line is pretty typical in Old English, like almost formulaic even. On the earth, we've seen this before on Foldan. I think we have seen this before. No, I'm still searching some here. We've at least seen Foldan. No, sorry. I keep pressing Control F when I'm trying to press Control V and then Control F. Apologies. The reason I can't just type it is because it's using the unsealed characters. We really haven't seen Foldan. I could have sworn we've had it already. I guess not. Foldres on Foldan. Fodder on the earth. Or on land. So this thing, which makes sense as a counterpoint to the river. This thing is of the river fishes, and though it ever enjoys fodder on land, havet fire erd watre beworpen. It has a fair, and I think we've had erd recently, like a place, a home, an abode. It has a place, a home, watre beworpen. Beworpen by water. And bewerpen means to be sort of like cast around by, or cast about by, encompassed by, surrounded by. Surrounded is probably the easiest translation there. Surrounded by water. So this thing is of the river fishes, and though it ever enjoys food on land, it has a fair home surrounded by water. Tharhe winnum leavath, where he lives, leavath, liveth, winnum, enjoy, where he lives in joy. So this thing is of the river fishes. It, though it always enjoys food on land, or frequently enjoys food on land, ever, it has a fair home, surrounded by water, where he enjoys, or where he lives in joy. There we go. So that is Iar. Now, interpretation. We have no idea, just going off of the word, just looking at Iar or Ior or Er, we have no clue in heck what this means. The theory behind it is that it means eel. I think that's the one I see the most often for translating this, but we're just not sure. It's a mystery still, kind of. Eel kind of makes sense. It's a water fish. That's kind of what people are going on. It's water fish. I'm not an expert on eels. I'm not sure if they eat on land or not. Someone who knows more about eels could probably help with that. But that's what I've seen put forward most of the time is eel. I don't think I've really seen any other fish. Some others might propose another fish, but I don't think I've seen. If it has happened, it didn't stick in my mind because I see eel so often. Now, eel, there is an English word for eel. It's al. Al means eel. That's where we get the word eel from. Now, this actually, strangely, reminds me that I didn't talk about ash in a modern English context. So, ash, I talked about the tree, and that's what it is, and this is where we get the word ash, as in the ash tree, and the name ash, like the given name for a person, usually is named after the tree. Now, there is also the word ash, as in the stuff left behind by a fire, and it is not from this word in Old English. There's a different word, asha. I believe it's feminine. Or neuter. I'm second-guessing the gender. Anyway, it ends with an E in the nominative singular in Old English, asha, and it comes from a different Proto-Germanic root, I believe. Even a different Indo-European root, I think. It just both become ash. So in sort of like the Middle English period, they kind of coalesced. Like they would have been pronounced the same. And so we end up with ash meaning both. But in Old English, they're separate, asha versus ash. Ash, the tree, asha, the dust particles from fire. All right, so it's 2 minutes until we usually end. We have one more rune poem. And something in the air told me that I was going to finish today, so I think we're going to do it. We have one more. So this one was kind of a mystery. Maybe it's an eel or some kind of watery fish that it can also eat on land. Could it be a frog even? Or some kind of amphibian? I'm not sure. I don't think that the root, I cannot parse what the root of this would be etymologically at all. So I'm really uncertain as to what the answer is. And there's no consensus, though the most frequent suggestion I see is eel. All right, let's read the last one. We can do it. We can finish the rune poem today. The Old English rune poem will be completed today. So let's get this one. And this is another one where the meaning is a little muddy. I'm going to say muddy. Muddy is a good word for this here. So it's ar, which interestingly is what this would be West Saxonized to, because this diphthong doesn't really exist in West Saxon. I-A-R. Does not exist in West Saxon. If it were West Saxonized, it would be ar. But that's this one, interestingly. All right, ar. E-A-R. I know it does not mean ear. I will say that. Ar is ear in Old English. It is a weak neuter noun. Ar, with an E at the end. Is where we get the ear from. Ear as in the body part. There is another modern English word ear that you might think of, and I don't actually think that's what this one is either. I don't think I've seen anyone suggest that, but again, we'll get through it. Let's read this. I said I could stay a few minutes over, so let's see if we can finish this last poem. Arbith eila erla yehwilkun thonne inundation there. Thonne fastliche flash on yenneth. Hrau kolian chruzan cheuzan. Blak to je beddan blede je dreuzaf. Winna je weetath wara je sweekath. This one's a very melodic one. I know there's like a lot of almost rhyme in this one. I really like it. So, ar, whatever this thing is, we'll get that in, is eila eorla je huilkon. And this N is sort of one of those late West Saxon, what would typically be an M. It is eila eorla je huilkon. This is another each of nobles. It is a eila. Eila is loathsome, hideous, horrible, terrifying. This thing is horrible to everyone, to each among nobles, to each among people. Because again, even though we're using nobles because it's poetry, this usually just means everybody. This thing is horrible to everyone. Thunna fastliche flash on yinneth hrau kolian. So when I emended this E, because probably what Hick saw was a thun, F-O-N, with a line over it, and he was like, oh, adding a line adds an N. But with the word thunne, usually it means add an N-E, because thun isn't really a word, but thunne is. It's just one of those scribal things that we're used to nowadays in Old English, but maybe he just was following the rule a little too stringently, just adding an N. So, thunne fastliche flash on yinneth. When this is fastliche, again, firmly, reliably, flesh on yinneth. On yinnan is begin. Usually in Old English it's on yinnan instead of be yinnan. I think there might be some examples of be yinnan, but it's not the most common way to say begin. It's on yinnan. When flesh begins, hrau kolian. Hrau, usually it's hrau instead of hrau, but hrau means a corpse. It's it's related to the word raw in modern English. R-A-W is H usually at the beginning of a word before an R or an L goes away. So hrau is a corpse, something raw flesh. The corpse kolian. So when the flesh begins, and then we have a corpse, and then kolian is the verb to cool. That's where I get cool. The kol part of this becomes cool as a verb. A corpse to cool. So I think hrau here is just another way of saying flash here. When the flesh begins, the corpse, to cool. And hruzan cheozan. Hruzan we've seen before. Hruza is the earth, the ground, and cheozan is to choose. So when the flesh begins to cool and to choose the earth, choose the ground, and the flesh, the corpse, begins to cool to choose the earth, blak to yebeddan. Blak is something that a lot of people might be confused about. Blak with a long here, and there's a related word, black. They get confused with each other sometimes. Black is where we get the word black from, the color. And blak is actually where we get the word bleak from. And blak is a noun form related to the verb blikan. And blikan means to shine, actually. Blikan is to shine. And so blak is like pale, like white hot kind of idea. Blikan to shine. Both words come from an Indo-European root for like to burn. Or to shine. So like on one hand, shining can be bright and pale. On the other hand, burning something causes it to become dark. So from the same root, we have the word black and the word for pale in Old English, blak. And this is where we get the word bleak from, which has kind of changed meaning a bit in modern English, but you can kind of see how it goes from meaning sort of pale to meaning a sort of dire situation, a bleak situation. So it chooses the earth, pale, or paleness even, to yebeddan. And this is the word yebeda, which it's related to the word bed. It means like a bedfellow, a partner, a consort, a spouse. And we have to, and then what's probably a dative here, which is how we usually say something like as, like taking the role of. So pale as a bedfellow, or paleness as a bedfellow, because it's growing cool. The body is growing cool, choosing the ground as a bedfellow. Blak maybe is describing hrau even. It's just kind of separated to retain the alliteration here with the B's here. Blak to yebeddan, bleda, yedreozaf. We've seen bled a few times as well. Bled is like prosperity. Prosperity, what does prosperity do? Bleda, yedreozaf. Dreozan, or yedreozan in this case, means to fail. It could be it's like to fall, as in like to die and like fall in battle, or just to fail, to falter. Yedreozath. So prosperity goes away, vanishes. And then we have winna yewitath. Winna is the plural of win, joy. So joys, yewitath. Yewitan is to depart, to leave. Joys depart. Wera yeswikath. And this is probably the word wad, feminine noun, meaning a promise or a contract, an oath. Wada. Wad is the word here, faithfulness, promise. And again, promises, plural. Yeswikath. Yeswikan is to, another way to say like to fail, to waver. Swikan. Yeswikan here probably means like to falter or to vanish. Promises fail, faith falters, that kind of thing. So this thing is horrible to everyone when firmly the flesh begins, the corpse, to cool and to choose the earth, pale, as a bedfellow. Prosperity fails, joy passes away, and promises falter. So really bleak way, even block, to end the rune poem here. Now what does ad mean? So here are possibilities given. What we see in other manuscripts, what this sequence here, ad, means in other places. Ad can be an ear, as in an ear of corn, like an ear of a grain. Ad is used for that. This is probably not that. It doesn't really make sense for wheat to be a dread to everyone who's starting to die. The other meaning of ad that we see in some manuscripts and other sources is it can mean like an ocean. We see it in the compound Ærgrund, which is the seabed, the ocean floor. Ærgrund. Ad is there means the ocean, the sea. Now, its cognates, however, in other Germanic languages, when it means sea or ocean in Old English, the cognate of that in Old Norse is aur, A-U-R-R, and in Old Norse it means like the earth, or the, it could be like mud, or wet sand, and that's usually how the root in Proto-Germanic is reconstructed, to mean sort of wet sand, or wet earth, mud, and that's why I said the meaning of this is a bit muddy. I was making a pun on the potential meaning of this. It means mud or earth in Old Norse. Now, trying to make sense of it in this context here, does the sea make sense? We've talked about how an ear of grain doesn't make sense, but how about the sea? The sea is horror to everyone when their flesh firmly begins to cool, choose the earth as a bedfellow. The sea doesn't really make that much sense here, because sea burial was not actually a very common thing. People were usually buried in the ground. That's what we usually see in the archaeological record. So one interpretation is that this might be our only instance of surviving Old English where this word ad is sort of retaining its meaning that it has in Old Norse, where it means earth, and that the sense that we're supposed to understand from this is that it means grave. And that's how I usually see this translated. When I see modern translations of the rune poem, I usually see ad translated as grave. However, this would be the only instance in Old English that I've ever seen, and that most people have ever seen, that has this word meaning grave, actually. We only really ever see it as sea. I've seen ad glossed as ground, but the only example I've ever seen given as an example of that is this poem. So when people translate it as ground, this is their evidence for that. This and the sort of etymology where it links it to the Old Norse word that means earth or mud. Mud, just straightforward mud, could also work here. Mud is a terror to anyone whose corpse is rotting. You know, if your corpse is underground, it would suck for it to be muddy around, because that's going to sort of lead to decay faster if you want to preserve that. So, unless it's sort of like a marshy situation, in which case you might actually be preserving the body in a weird way. But I think translating it as ground or grave does make sense, but this would be sort of the only survival of that, which is kind of interesting. So definitely like a kind of sad or spooky way to end the Old English rune poem, but that is the final rune in the rune poem that we see. Now we see Hicks list some more runes here. This one that he names Stan, which I think I've only ever seen in manuscripts as a ST sound. And then this one that he labels God, which is like the Yevu rune, the G one, but it has like sort of this ing triangle over it to make it sort of a stronger G. I think I might have seen an example of this in manuscript, but I might be fabricating that memory. The thing is, we don't really see these in the few rune inscriptions that we have of Old English. We don't really see these there. Many of these like special to Old English ones. We see some of them like Eid. Oh, here's a good example. This is what it looks like when you cross the middle of Eid. To compare it to the Unicode font that shows up here, where it's not barred, and we have the bar across here. Both show up. We have both examples of both in the record, so that's why Unicode was one. I think some fonts will give you this instead. Now there's also these ones down here. There's this one that it's labeled Queorth, which some people have speculated is a qua, like he was using it for qua, that he put a Q here. There's no poem that goes with that one. And then there's this is the flipped Eorch Sedge one, flipped over here. And this is, I think I've seen other manuscripts where this is called Kalk. And it's in theory used for K instead of Ch, because the C palatalizes sometimes in Old English. The K sound becomes Ch in a lot of contexts. Now, I think this one actually doesn't occur in quite a few examples of Old English runes that we have. Some artifacts, this K does show up as K there instead of a C. What's the rune? It's Cain. Here's what it looks like in the Unicode font here. So you can kind of imagine it's just like a mirrored version of itself overlapping with it. But it does look like just a flipped Eox. And we'll see one that looks identical to that in the Old Norse rune poem, but it is this rune, but it represents the Z sound of Proto-Germanic that becomes more like a Z sound in early Old Norse. Alright, so that is the Old English rune poem. We finished. Which, I mean, we did go over a bit, but I did say we'd finish today. So we are finishing with this, and what we'll be doing next time, as I've sort of alluded to, is we are going to be looking at some Gothic. We're going to take a break from rune poems, and we're going to look at some pieces of Gothic writing, just to give you a flavor of what that's like. And then the following week, we're going to get back to rune poems, and we're going to look at the Old Norse rune poems, the Old Norwegian and the Old Icelandic rune poem. So that is the plan for the next few weeks. Thank you for everyone who was able to join and participate in the chat today. And thank you anyone who's watching this in the future. I'm very excited that we actually got through the rune poem a week earlier than I had actually initially planned. So, yeah, I hope everyone has a good rest of your day, or whatever time zone it is for you. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you.